Morning, everyone. This week's learning has been sponsored by Rima Namova in memory of her mother, Faina Sirkina, and her aunt, Rachel Tzivia Bashmuel. We are up to Perikimel Mishna Daled, Chapter 3, Mishna 4. Matza Ketzitzais Baderech. A person found ketzitzais. Ketzitzais means cut figs. When figs were to be dried, they were first be clipped in order to release some of their juice to drain out. And then as they were drying, they are called either ketzitzais or ketziois. And once they have completely dried, they're called groigrois. So here we're talking about, you found these ketzitzais, you found these clipped figs on the road. Even if you found them right next to a field where you see these clipped figs drying out. And therefore, there's definitely a place to consider that this is where they came from. Let's have a fig tree that is leaning over a road, and you find figs under it. So again, makes sense to say that came from this tree. So now somebody finds it. And the Mishna says, Mutaris Mishum Gazal, they're permitted and there's no concern of stealing. Upeturais min ha'maisris, and they are exempt from any kind of separation of Trumas and Maisris. What's happening here is that these are lost. This is a lost article. A lost article, the Torah obligates us to return to its owner unless the owner is miyayish, unless the owner gives up hope from ever getting it back. If that takes place, if we can assume that takes place, then this lost object is ownerless and you can take it. So what we're saying here in this case is that although we found these figs under the tree, somebody who finds these figs doesn't have to give it back to the owner of the tree. He can take it for himself. That's because the Mishna is saying that the owner is miyayish. The owner gives up hope from ever getting them back. He assumes that people who are going to find this are not going to relate it back to the tree, and therefore they're going to take it for themselves. So whoever gives up hope from getting it back, it becomes ownerless. Once it becomes ownerless, the halacha is that ownerless produce, there is no obligation at all to separate Trumas and Maisros from, ever. So therefore here, we're saying, number one, we assume that the owner is miyayish, gives up hope from them, and therefore you can keep them. And number two, now that you have acquired them from a state of hefker, of being ownerless, they are exempt completely from any kind of separating of Trumas and Maisros. Now, what about the fact that you did find it under the tree? That doesn't mean anything. And the Rav explains that although by falling under the tree, there should be good reason to argue that's where it came from, nonetheless, the problem is that once the fig falls off the tree, it gets kind of smashed. And it doesn't necessarily look anymore like the figs that are on the tree. And therefore, since the identification of them is not clear, it's possible it could have fallen from someone else. Doesn't mean it came necessarily from this tree. Therefore, the owner doesn't expect that someone's going to give it back to him. And therefore, the owner gives up hope, and therefore, you are now permitted to keep it. The same thing when you find the clipped figs next to the field of clipped figs. Yeah, there's a good reason to go ahead and say that it came from there, but it's not certain. It could be that somebody dropped them. Somebody was carrying them and dropped them. I think I would add that, clipped figs that are already starting to dry, there's no, as we'll see we'll see soon of a situation not like this, but there's no real way of identifying and saying these came from that field at this point. And at this point, they're clipped and starting to dry. And therefore, the owner gives up hope from them being returned to him. And therefore, the one who finds it is permitted to keep it and has no obligation to separate Trumas and Maisros from it. Now, if we're talking about olives or carobs, meaning olives that are under an olive tree or carobs under a carob tree, then we say things are different. Then we say chayavim, that they're actually liable. There's an obligation to Shemis and Maasros. Now, actually, what's really happening here by the olives and the carobs is that not to keep them either. And that's because, let me read to you how they explain it down here. The coloring of fruit is somewhat different from tree to tree. Okay, again, the coloring of fruit is somewhat different from tree to tree. Someone finding olives or carobs under a tree can easily identify whether they came from that tree. Unlike figs, these fruits are tougher and do not become damaged much by their fall from the tree. The owner of the tree therefore assumes that people passing by will not take them for themselves and that he will get them back. So therefore, the Mishnah, so what's really happening is like this. What's really happening is that if we're saying that by the case of the olives and the carobs, you find it under the tree, it's easily identifiable that it came from this tree, that therefore the owner doesn't give up hope. If the owner doesn't give up hope from getting it back, then you can't keep it. So when the Mishnah says chayavim, they're going to be obligated in separating Shemis and Maasros, it doesn't mean you're going to be obligated because you can't keep it. You got to give it back to the owner. When the owner gets it back, he's going to be obligated in Shemis and Maasros because he's not getting them back from hefker. He's not reacquiring them from a state of yish, from a state of being ownerless. They're being returned to him because they should be returned to him, and therefore, and he knows that, and he doesn't give up any hope from it. And therefore, he's just getting back what's his. So the person who finds it can't keep it. So the person, if he can't keep it, he's not going to separate Shemis and Maasros from it. But it's going to get back to the owner, and the owner is going to have to be separate Shemis and Maasros from it. But the point is that we have here a difference between the olives and the carobs under the tree and the figs. The olive and the carobs under the tree are easily identifiable that they came from this tree. The owner doesn't give up hope, and therefore you cannot keep them. Okay, next. Matzah gregris. A person found dried figs. Now, he's finding these dried figs. He's not finding them in any place next to other dried figs. That's not the case here. Okay, we're not talking about, again, I don't know if we make much of it. Right. The point is, I guess that's what they bring down here in the art school. These figs were not found next to a field of dried figs, but somewhere else. Since there is no way of identifying the owner, they consider ownerless. The point is by the dried figs, in this case, that you found them in a situation where they cannot be identified at all. And therefore, if they cannot be identified at all, the owner is going to give up hope. They're ownerless, you could acquire them. The issue is, though, that when they're dried figs, there is already more of a question. There's another question, and that question is, was their processing complete? If the processing was complete, then the fact that it became odorless after that point of time will make a difference. So if, let's say, you found these dried figs, and you would have to assume that their processing was complete, then even though the person lost them afterwards, and he gives up hope from getting them back, and you can take them, but that in that situation, hefker being odorless isn't going to exempt this produce from Shemis and Maasros. Hefker making it ownerless, either like we have the case of yish, when the person gives up hope when he loses it, only exempts from Shemis and Maasros when that takes place before the processing is completed. But after the processing is completed, it doesn't make a difference. You can keep it, but it won't exempt you from Shemis and Maasros. So now you found these dried figs. Okay, now dried figs, we said previously, the point of their gemar malacha, the point of their processing being complete, is when they're squashed into a barrel. So you found these semi-squashed grogris. You found these, they were squashed. The thing is, though, you don't know, were they squashed because they were squashed in the barrel and then they fell out? Or, which would mean that they were processed and then they fell out and then they became ownerless. Or maybe the person dropped them before they were in the barrel. And the reason they're squashed is because people stepped on it. So matzah gregris, you find these dried figs, and you really don't have any way of looking at these dried figs and saying, "Oh, I know the processing was completed." So the Mishnah says, "Im darsu rev b'nei adam chayev im lav pater." If in this place the majority of people have already squashed their figs into barrels, then you have to assume that these figs fell from those people. And although they're giving up hope from it, but that means that the processing was completed. And therefore, you're going to have to separate Shemus and Maisus from it. But if not, Pater, if this is not, meaning the majority have not squashed their figs into the barrels, only a minority has. Okay, so then the assumption is when you find these that it fell from the majority. It means it fell from the majority who have not squashed their figs. That means these figs were not processed. Even though they look a little squashed, that's because people stepped on them. So in this case where we cannot look at the figs and identify whether their processing has been completed or not, we follow what is the situation in where they've been found. If the place is a place where most people already squashed their figs, then you got to assume that this fig came from the people who squashed their figs in the barrels. Its processing has been completed, and you have to separate Shemus and Maisus from it. If the majority of people have not done that, then you can assume that they have fallen from the people who have not done that. The processing hasn't been completed. You're acquiring it from a state of being ownerless, and therefore you'll be completely exempt from Shemus and Maisus. Matzah pilchei devei lachayev. But if you find cut pieces of a cake of figs, then you're going to have to separate Shemus and Maisus. Sheyadua shein midar gamer, because it's known that it's from a completed fig. Here we're talking about pilchei devei. As we've said, you clip the figs, you dry them out, and then either they were, again, squashed into this barrel, or they were pressed into these round cakes of figs. And then after they were pressed, you'd cut them into slices and give it to people or sell it to people. So when people got these pieces, these pieces that were figs that were pressed together. So now, and that is the completion of the processing we've done previously. The previous Mishnah taught us that when it comes to dried figs, if they've been pressed into a cake of figs, the processing is complete, and they now are Shemus and Maisus to the point that you can't snap from them. So therefore, when you find these slices or these pieces of figs together, you know it came from pressed figs. It means you know from a cake of pressed figs, because that's what they would come from, and you know that the process has been completed, and therefore the fact that you can keep it now doesn't exempt you from separating Shemus and Maisus from it. Okay, new case. The Charuvin, carobs. Now, the way by carobs was that they would take the carobs to the top of the roofs, let them dry there. Once they were dried and they were piled up, that was when their processing was completed. So the Charuvin, we're not talking about finding Charuvin now. That's not the case here. They weren't lost Charuvin. It's a person, he's got these carobs, and he's got them on the roof. They have not yet fully dried, they have not been piled up. The processing has not been completed. Actually, kanasan l'reish hagag, before you have gathered them at the top of your roof, meaning they have dried and you have piled them up, but it's before that point. Marid behem lebehema, and you want to bring some down to feed your animals. Pater, you will be exempt from separating Shemus and Maisus, and you can feed it to your animals. Because anything extra that's left over that the animals aren't going to eat, you're going to put them back up to dry out. Now, what's happening is like this. Halacha is that if produce has not been completely processed, has reached Gemar Malacha, so we know that a person can snack from them. You can feed them to your animals as much as you want. Feeding animals there's no difference between a regular way of eating and a temporary or an irregular way of eating, snacking. No such thing by animals. By animals, you can feed them whatever they need to eat as long as it's before the processing has been completed. So therefore, the Mishnah says here, when you have these unprocessed dried figs on the roof, bring them down and feed them to your animal. There's no problem. Because again, the processing hasn't been completed, and therefore you can feed your animal as much as you want. But there's still a question here. And the question is like this. And this is what the Mishnah, when it says, because you return the extras, you put the extras back, That's what those words mean to say. Because we just said that there is no problem with unprocessed produce to give it to an animal. So what do we need this part of the Mishnah says? Because you return the extra back. So here we're dealing with a different question. The question is like this. If it's unprocessed, then we can give it to our animals. The thing is, though, that the figs, the dried figs that I decided to take down from my roof and feed my animals, I'm not planning on drying them anymore. If I'm not planning on drying them anymore, they should be considered processed. They're done. They're done. There's nothing more I'm going to do with them. They've been brought in from the field. They're in your courtyard. They're in your domain. They're processed. They're complete. There's nothing more to do with them. So they should be considered processed. And if they're considered processed produce, you cannot give to an animal until you separate shemis and meisus from it. So why don't we have that problem? On that, the Mishnah says, because whatever is left over, whatever the animal doesn't eat, you're going to put back up there to dry. And therefore, so let me read to you how the notes here in the art scroll explain it. The Mishnah answered that since he will return whatever carobs the animals leave over to the roof, all the carobs he removed are still considered part of the batch that is drying on the roof. There's an idea here that you have these carobs and you take them, you're giving them to your animals, but you don't know which one. This way I understand it. You don't know which ones the animals which one's going to go back. Any one of them can land up going back because extras go back up, and therefore, even all of these figs that you have right now, which some of them you're going to feed to the animals, are still considered part of the batch that's drying on the roof. Now, since the majority of the batch is not considered finished, because the majority is still in the process of drying, it hasn't been piled up, even the ones he removed to feed his animals are not considered finished, and he does not have to separate meisus from them before feeding them to his animals. The fact that they are still considered part of the batch up there tells you to follow the majority of the batch up there in the sense of that not considering it finished. So although, practically speaking, they're finished, but since they still belong to the batch up there, because any of them could go back up there, so even the ones that you're going to feed your animals are still considered part of that batch, since the majority of that batch of figs are not processed, even the ones you're feeding to your animals are not considered processed. And therefore, as long as they're not processed up there, you can feed them to your animal. Now, what's interesting is to note is that all it says in the Mishnah is when you bring them down, you can feed it to your animal. Why can't you? It doesn't say you can eat it. You're the owner of these figs. You can't eat it. Why not? They're not processed. Why can't I snack from them? And the answer is, again, similar to an issue we had before. And that is, if you bring down these figs and you start eating them, people might think that they were processed up there. They don't see what's going on up there. They're going to think, why you're eating it? Because it's been processed. But if it's been processed, we see you bringing it down. We see you eating it. We don't see you separating shemis and meisus from it. So you're going to be suspect of eating from the processed figs without shemis and meisus. And therefore, you cannot eat it when it comes down from the roof. Your animals could, because if they were processed, you wouldn't be feeding them to your animals. Processed figs don't get fed to animals. It's only the unprocessed ones. So if people see you giving it to the animals, they're not going to say, oh, it's processed. How can you give it to the animals? You only give to the animals the ones that are not processed. But the ones that you eat, I mean the owner eats, the problem is that people are going to suspect that, well, it must be that they were completed. That's why he's eating it. But he's eating it without separating shemis and meisus. Therefore, once they come down from the roof, the owner can't eat it. Up on the roof, where anybody could see that they're not processed, the owner can snack. It's not processed. But down on the ground where they can't see that it's not processed, people will suspect the owner of eating already completely processed because it makes sense. It came down, he's eating it. They must have been processed. And they're going to see him eating without separate shemis and meisus. Therefore, we say he cannot even snack from them when they come down from the roof, even though they haven't been processed yet. Okay. Now we have the 17th prohibition that the Chavetz Chaim says one can possibly transgress when speaking Lashon Hara. There are times where there is another prohibition involved. Unfortunately, we find, says the Chavetz Chaim, that people will speak Lashon Hara about someone when they're angry. They get angry at a person, and that's when they start putting them down. And while he is angrily disparaging him, he curses him. He can come in, he's going to curse him out of his anger. And it could come out that he's going to curse the person using God's name, even if he doesn't use God's name in Hebrew. He just uses the spoken language word for Hashem, like God. But he uses that word to curse the person. He's not even got to curse the person. Doing so is the Torah's prohibition rather, of not to curse a deaf person. And as the Chavetz Chaim points out, the prohibition is not only to curse a deaf person. Torah means even a deaf person doesn't hear you, you're not allowed to curse. Or the more so somebody who does hear you. So here we're dealing with a situation with somebody who does hear you, but he doesn't have to hear it. So therefore the Chavetz Chaim says that there's a potential to transgress this prohibition of cursing someone when you speak Lashon out of anger, which can bring you to curse someone. Says the Chavetz Chaim now, so this is the completion of listing the 17 prohibitions that are common for a person to transgress, even if the only person he's speaking to is another Jew. The Mumashan Yisrael b'fnei kusi, because if he disparages or speaks negatively or talks to a non-Jew about the wrong things that a fellow Jew is doing, prohibition is even greater. Actually, you can even fall into what's called an informer, because if you're telling somebody, a non-Jew, what something illegal this person is doing, and that gets that person in trouble, you become an informer. And that carries some very, very serious, besides being very serious sin, it carries some serious repercussions. Some of the prohibitions we mentioned before, such as causing pain through Lashon Hara to a widow or an orphan, or desecrating Hashem's name when doing so, actually carries the possibility of a punishment of death by the hands of heaven. And many of them are even relevant to whether a person could lose a portion of the world to come. Like someone who embarrasses somebody in public, or someone who basically honors himself for someone else's degradation. That can come to someone who habitually, someone who has made himself used to speaking Lashon Hara and Rechilas, that person is liable to get himself into some very serious sins and their repercussions. And therefore, the Chavetz Chaim says this is the point of this is how he concludes this part of the discussion of Lashon Hara, but enumerating all the prohibitions involved. These are prohibitions. That alone makes it serious. Some of them carry some very serious repercussions to them. And a person who is not careful about speaking Lashon Hara, a person who commonly speaks Lashon Hara, there's a very good chance that he's going to stumble in these and in some very serious sins. Have a wonderful day.